Before we get started, I'd like to invite our New York audience to go out and vote. Mabuiga, welcome back to the Garifuna Experience podcast. I'm your host, José Francisco Ávila. In episode 49, I introduced Garifuna VOICE, voting and organizing to increase civic engagement, our roadmap to the table of power. Having recently completed voter registration for the 2026 New York primary election, and as we gear up for National Voter Registration Day, we are dedicating today's episode to a crucial explainer. We are breaking down the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993, and the significance of National Voter Registration Day. What exactly is the Voting Rights Act? Signed into law by President Lyndon B. Johnson on August 6, 1965, the Voting Rights Act is widely considered the crown jewel of the civil rights movement. It stands as the most effective piece of civil rights legislation in United States history. The Voting Rights Act wasn't just a one-time fix. It was renewed, expanded, and strengthened by Congress in 1970, 1975, 1982, and again in 2006 when it passed the Senate unanimously and was signed by President George W. Bush. But why was it so desperately needed in the first place? The U.S. Constitution does not explicitly grant an absolute right to vote. Instead, it gives states the power to set their own voting policies. While voting right-related amendments, specifically the 15th, 19th, and 26th Amendments, prevent discrimination based on race, ethnicity, sex, and age, they basically just state that if a state grants voting rights to one group, it cannot deny them to another. Following the Civil War, the 15th Amendment was passed in 1870, making it unconstitutional to deny a person the right to vote based on race. In theory, black men were legally granted the right to vote, though women of all races were still excluded. Yet, despite the 15th Amendment, people of color were systematically disenfranchised for nearly a century under Jim Crow segregation. State and local governments exploited legal loopholes to suppress black voters without explicitly naming race. They used tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests were established primarily to limit the voting rights of African Americans, particularly in the southern United States. All-white primaries and grandfather clauses. Following Reconstruction, the Democratic Party maintained a near-total political monopoly across the American South. State parties designated themselves as private organizations or clubs, meaning they could establish their own internal membership rules and bar non-white individuals from participating in primary elections. The grandfather clause exempted anyone from this test if they or their lineal ancestors had the right to vote prior to 1867. The grandfather clause exempted anyone from this test if they or their lineal ancestors had the right to vote prior to 1867. Because enslaved African Americans were not granted the right to vote until the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870, virtually no black citizens could claim the exemption. This allowed illiterate whites to bypass the rules while leaving black voters at the mercy of highly discriminatory literacy tests. Even after the Civil Rights Acts passed in 1964, black citizens faced immense barriers during that year's presidential election. It took thousands of people putting their lives on the line. Demonstrations, including the historic Selma to Montgomery March led by Congressman John Lewis and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to force the federal government to pass the Voting Rights Act. The Voting Rights Act finally established that proactive, concrete protections that should have been guaranteed back in 1870. What made the Voting Rights Act so powerful? It didn't just outlaw discrimination. It identified the exact places where discrimination was most likely to happen and built a wall to stop it. Two sections were absolutely critical to this. Section 4B established the formula to pinpoint state and local governments with a proven history of voting rights violations. Section 5 required those flagged jurisdictions to get pre-clearance from the federal government before making any changes to their voting laws. Essentially, if a state with a history of voter suppression wanted to change a polling place, alter registration deadlines, or redraw a district, they had to prove to the Department of Justice that the change will not discriminate against voters of color. Beyond pre-clearance, the Voting Rights Act also sent federal observers to monitor elections on the ground, required bilingual ballots, and language assistance for non-English speaking citizens, banned strict residency requirements for presidential elections. Eventually, states like Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia, along with parts of California, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, and even right here in New York State, fell under these strict federal requirements. So where does the Voting Rights Act stand today? To put it bluntly, modern U.S. Supreme Court decisions have severely crippled it. First came Shelby County versus Holder in 2013. Shelby County, Alabama, challenged the pre-clearance requirements. In a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that while pre-clearance itself was constitutional, the formula in Section 4B used to determine which states needed it was outdated and therefore unconstitutional. They left it to Congress to update the formula. Because Congress has not updated it, no states are currently subject to pre-clearance. Section 5 is completely unenforceable. As the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg famously wrote in her dissent, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. Predictably, this opened the floodgates to a wave of restrictive voting laws. Without pre-clearance, we have to fight suppressive laws in court after they have already passed. By then, the damage is done, and elections have already taken place under unfair rules. Then, in 2021, the case Vernovich versus Democratic National Committee weakened the law further, making it much harder to challenge state-level restrictions like limits on mail-in ballots. Most recently, on April 29, 2026, the Supreme Court delivered another massive blow in Louisiana versus Callais. In a 6-3 decision, the court struck down Louisiana's second majority black congressional district as an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, effectively gutting the practical enforcement of Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. This decision invalidates decades of legal precedent and makes it profoundly harder for communities of color to challenge biased redistricting maps that dilute our political power. Voting Rights Act typically are redrawn once a decade after each U.S. Census to account for population changes. But last summer, President Donald Trump urged Texas Republicans to redraw congressional districts to try to win additional seats in the midterm elections, providing grounds for Republicans in other states to reshape districts with large minority populations that have elected Democrats. How do we fight back? We hold our leaders accountable. The Supreme Court didn't say federal oversight is illegal. They told Congress to fix the formula. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is designed to do exactly that, but it remains stalled by the Senate filibuster. We must put pressure on our representatives. And where the federal government fails, states can step up. In 2022, New York State passed the New York State John Lewis Voting Rights Act, becoming the first state in the nation to build its own state-level pre-clearance process. This brings us to another foundational piece of legislation, the National Voter Registration Act of 1993. Signed by President Bill Clinton, the National Voter Registration Act completely revolutionized how Americans register to vote. It's famously called the Motor Voter Law because it requires states to allow eligible citizens to register to vote when applying for or renewing their driver's license at the Department of Motor Vehicles. The National Voter Registration Act made registration vastly more accessible, which is vital because registration is always the very first barrier to the ballot box. Even today, about 25% of eligible Americans remain unregistered. The gap is widest among young people, low-income communities, and young people of color. Historically, organizations like Rock the Vote stepped out to maximize the impact of the National Voter Registration Act. In the 90s, they partnered with MTV and major artists to launch massive civic campaigns, eventually launching the first online voter registration platforms. Today, thanks to the foundation laid by the National Voter Registration Act, 42 states offer online registration and 24 states feature automatic voter registration. This brings us directly to our collective call to action, National Voter Registration Day. This is a nonpartisan civic holiday dedicated entirely to celebrating democracy. Since it started in 2012, a massive collection of partners has helped register over 6.5 million Americans. Mark your calendars. This year, National Voter Registration Day takes place on Tuesday, September 15th. It is a single 24-hour democracy blitz designed to reach the millions of people who miss deadlines, forget to update their address, or simply don't know how to navigate the system. Voter suppression tactics aim to dictate who can vote so they can control the outcome of an election. When protections in the courts fade, our only counter strategy is massive, undeniable voter turnout. We must register and we must show up to vote. Remember, your vote is your voice, and your voice is your power. And that wraps up another episode of the Garifuna Experience podcast. Thank you for listening. Remember, the future of the Garifuna people is in our hands. Our vote is our voice, and our voice is our power. Until next time, stay united, stay proud. Sungube Lida Aba. Ayo. You can find new episodes of the Garifuna Experience podcast every Tuesday on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, YouTube, Amazon Music, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Please take a moment to rate and review the Garifuna Experience podcast. It helps our history, our stories, and our voices reach the world.